The evening sun was sinking behind the ragged hills, turning the sky into strokes of bruised purple and fading gold as the cowboy, Mason Hale, rode along the barren trail with dust rising behind his horse's hooves, unaware that destiny was about to pull him into a story far heavier than the supplies in his thul bag. He'd been on the road for days, delivering goods for the Mazten ranch, and though he was no stranger to hardship, something in the wind tonight carried the unmistakable scent of trouble, the feeling that someone nearby was suffering in silence. And when he passed the old willow grove by the dried riverbed, he heard it, a faint, trembling sound like a cry smothered before it could escape. Mason pulled on his reins, scanning the shadows until he noticed a crooked cabin leaning against the slope, half-collapsed and looking as though it had been abandoned long ago. Yet a thin thread of smoke drifted from the chimney, wavering like a plea for help. He approached slowly, hand resting on the handle of his revolver more out of instinct than fear, and dismounted as the last light of day settled behind him. The door hung open by one hinge, creaking softly in the cold wind, and when Mason stepped inside, the scene froze him in place, on the floor near the stone hearth. Curled together beneath a frayed blanket were 5 small children so thin their bones pressed against their skin, and beside them sat a woman, pale, exhausted, trembling from hunger and cold, holding the youngest child close to her chest as though her body alone could keep him alive. She looked up at him with hollow eyes that had cried every tear they had long ago, and tried to rise but stumbled before she could stand. Mason rushed forward and caught her gently by the arms, feeling how light she was, how fragile, as if the wind itself could snap her in two. She tried to speak, but her voice cracked into a whisper, the kind of whisper that carried more pain than sound. We haven't eaten in days." The words hit Mason like a blow, ripping through the armor he had built around his own grief, reminding him of the family he once lost, of the child he never got to hold. The youngest boy, no older than 4, reached out with shaking fingers toward Mason as though begging for rescue, and the cowboy felt something awaken inside him, something fierce, something protective, something he thought had died with his own wife. Without hesitation, he lowered the woman gently back onto the blanket and dropped to his knees, pulling open his thul bag with clumsy urgency, taking out everything he had left: a packet of jerky, half a loaf of hard bread, 2 biscuits, dried apples. The children's eyes widened at the sight of food, their little breaths catching, their bodies leaning forward. Instinctively, though fear and exhaustion held them back, Mason tore the jerky into tiny pieces and placed them one by one into small outstretched hands, watching them nibble cautiously at first, then more eagerly as their starved bodies remembered what food felt like. The woman shook her head weakly when Mason offered her a piece, pushing it back toward her kids with trembling fingers. But Mason held it to her lips and said in a gentle yet unyielding tone, "Eat. You ain't doing them no favors by starvin' yourself." She obeyed only because her strength had fully deserted her, and tears slipped silently down her cheeks as she took her first bite of food in days. The fire in the hearth was little more than dying embers, and Mason hurried outside, splitting fallen branches with sharp, practiced swings, building a fire that crackled back to life with warmth that made the children curl closer together like kittens in a nest. Once the cabin was warmer, the woman finally managed to speak her name: Clara Rowan, widow of Benjamin Rowan, a farmhand who had died 2 winters ago in a cart accident that left her alone with 5 mouths to feed and no one willing to help a grieving woman who could barely keep her own feet under her. Work dried up. Neighbors turned cold. Clara sold everything she could until nothing was left but this broken cabin and her determination to keep her children alive even as the world squeezed every ounce of strength out of her. As Mason listened, rage simmered in his chest, not at Clara, not at fate, but at the cruelty of a town that had watched a woman and 5 innocent children wither away without lifting a hand. He promised her right there, in silence, that he would not be like them. He would not walk away. The eldest daughter, a girl of maybe 12 with tangled hair and eyes full of fear, whispered, "Mister, will you come back? Please." The little boy beside her held Mason's coat with tiny fingers. That begged for security. Mason swallowed hard, his throat tight with emotion he hadn't felt in years, and answered, "I ain't going nowhere till you're all safe." As the night deepened, he stayed by the fire, tending it, keeping watch, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders, but it wasn't a burden. It felt like purpose, like he had finally found the reason life had kept him wandering all these years. Clara drifted to sleep with her youngest child cradled against her, and the children curled into warmth they hadn't known in weeks. Mason sat on the floorboards, staring into the fire as memories of his own wife flickered across his mind, her smile, her gentle hands, the child they lost before birth. He clenched his jaw, blinking back grief, and whispered to the quiet cabin, "Not again. Not another family. Not if I can help it." When dawn arrived, pale and cold, Clara woke to find Mason still awake, still watching over them like a silent guardian. She tried to sit up, embarrassment and gratitude tangled in her expression. But Mason touched her arm lightly and said, "Don't fret, I'm coming back with food. Real food. Supplies too. Y'all ain't fighting this battle alone no more." She stared at him, disbelief and hope warring in her tired eyes. "Why?" she breathed. Mason looked at the 5 sleeping children, then back at her, and answered with a quiet rawness that made her heart tremble. "Because nobody deserves to whisper to the night that their kids ain't eaten in days." He stood, adjusted his hat, and added firmly, "You and your young uns. Your hungry days end today." And with those words echoing through the thin morning air, he mounted his horse and rode off, not as a stranger passing through, but as a man who had just found the purpose he'd been missing all his life.